Test 1 results for general psychology. So I'm going to go over the class stats, some challenging concepts, and tips for test taking. I also want to mention that if you missed Test 1 or you did poorly on Test 1, there's a makeup available at the end of the term, so you don't need to be stressed out. If you missed Test 1, there's a 0 recorded in the grade book. When you take the alternate version of the test, I will replace that 0 with whatever you score. If you completed Test 1 and you scored a low score and you retake it, I will average your first and second attempt. So no need to stress if you're having a low score right now. That's just a reminder of what would happen if you didn't take the makeup at the end. I'm providing you with some statistics based on all 5 sections of this class that I'm teaching. So this included 113 students, and the average was a 66.4 after extra credit. I do want to remind you that only about 25 to 30% of the students completed the extra credit. 21 students scored an A, 13 students scored a B, 18 students scored a C, 11 students scored a D, and 50 students fell in the needs improvement category. If you fell in the needs improvement category, remember we have an alternate test at the end of the semester, and you're welcome to take that, and I will average your first and second attempt. If you miss the test, whatever you score the second, on the alternate is what you will, what will be recorded in the grade book. Challenging concepts. So you might be wondering how I came up with these concepts. Basically, I looked at our test. We had 50 questions and it spanned over 5 chapters, and I reviewed the item analysis, and I found out how many people missed a particular item. So if there was a question where at least 50% of the class missed that item, then I reread the question and I looked at the concept that was being assessed. And so that's how I figured out which concepts people struggle with the most. So there's a few concepts from each chapter, and that's what the next few slides will be on. Okay, so for chapter 1, we have 5 concepts that I'm going to go over, and I'm going to go out of order, but the information is right here available on the slide. It's also available in the course textbook. You can also start a discussion on the questions thread in Canvas or email me at simsa@cf.edu. All right, so let's start with numbers 3 and 4 on the slide, psychoanalysis and behaviorism. So in chapter 1, you learned that there were several different perspectives. All right, these perspectives were different ways to understand people. And the psychoanalytic perspective, also referred to as the psychodynamic approach, basically said if you want to understand people, you need to think about their unconscious motivation. So people are going around living their lives and they're not even aware of why they're doing what they're doing. So the psychoanalytic approach was founded by Sigmund Freud, and the thing that you want to remember is that unconscious is important, and what happens to you early in your life, your early childhood, is very important for shaping who you are. Behaviorism was a reaction to psychoanalysis. So the behavioral movement basically said we shouldn't study what's going on in people's heads. That's too subjective. We need to be much more scientific, much more objective. So the behaviorists decided that they only wanted to focus on overt actions. And they said if we want to understand people, we should look at what they do consistently. We should look at what rewards and punishments they receive, because that's ultimately what shapes the behavior. So there were some other perspectives presented in chapter 1, and you guys seem to grasp those a little bit more clearly. But psychoanalysis and behaviorism, those were 2 of the most frequently missed questions on the test. All right, next is related to science. There was a question about sample and population that a lot of people missed. And the idea is a population is who the researcher wants to study, and the sample is just a subset of that population. Think of it like this. If you were at the mall and you were roaming around and someone said, hey, you want to try a sample? And so you took a little sample, right? a little piece of orange chicken and you were like, that's delicious, it's tasty. So you decide that based on that sample, the rest of the orange chicken must be good. Well, that's similar in social scientific research and psychological research. Scientists use a sample, all right, a small group, and they test that sample. And based on what they find out about the sample, they generalize to the population. Now, because the goal is to generalize to the population, you need to have a representative sample. The sample needs to be similar to the people that you're generalizing to. In much the same way as if someone gave you a sample of orange chicken, but then gave you orange chicken with General Tso's and sweet and sour, you might say, oh, well, this isn't what I tried out. So having a representative sample is really important. The next concept is dependent variable. And what you need to remember is that the independent variable is the variable the researcher is manipulating, whereas the dependent variable is the variable the researcher is measuring. So you can think of the dependent variable as the effect. The independent variable is the cause, the dependent variable is the effect. Our last item on this slide is negative correlation. And think of correlational research as a way to connect the dots, okay? You're usually comparing at least two things and you're seeing, are they related? That's really what it's about. You realize that this relationship is a statistical relationship and not necessarily a meaningful relationship. You'll have to do a little more investigation to figure out whether it's meaningful or not. But with a negative correlation, as one variable rises, the other goes down. So if you were doing a study on, say, level of attentiveness and length of lecture. So length of lecture as in how long I lecture, and level of attentiveness as in how attentive you are, how likely are you to pay attention to what I'm saying. That might be a negative correlation. The longer I lecture, the less attentive you are. The less I lecture, the more attentive you are. See how as one goes up, the other goes down? So with negative correlation, remember, one is going up and one is going down. With positive correlation, both variables are going up or both are going down. Challenging concepts. So now we're in chapter 2. Chapter 2 is all about the biological basis of behavior. There's a quote by David Myers that says, everything psychological is simultaneously biological. I like that quote because it really sums up what the biological foundations of behavior mean. Essentially, if you want to understand who people are, why they tick, what makes them do what they do, you can't ignore that they're a biological creature, and there are often explanations rooted in biology that will shed light on why the person did what they did or thought the way they thought. All right, so if you look in your textbook, you'll find a definition for biological psychology as the scientific study of the links between biological and psychological processes. All right. Now, the hypothalamus is a neural structure lying below hypo, the thalamus, and it directs several maintenance activities such as eating, drinking, body temperatures. It also helps govern the endocrine system via the pituitary gland and is linked to emotion and reward. There's a really cool experiment by Olds and Milner, classic study that's discussed in your book about rats that were pressing this lever to get a hit to feel good because their hypothalamus was being stimulated. So read a little bit more about that in your book. The medulla, think of it as handling basic, life survival functions like, without that medulla, you wouldn't be able to, breathe and have your heart beating steady. And then we have the amygdala, a structure that is almond-sized, and it's part of the limbic system, and most neuroscientists say that it's involved in regulating emotion. All right, some other terms here are myelin sheath and the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So the myelin sheath is simply the coating that goes on the axon of some neurons, and the purpose of the myelin sheath is to speed up neural communication. So remember, you have all these neurons in your nervous system, and they're basically communicating with one another, and that neural communication is the basis or the foundation for behavior. Well, in order for everything to go smoothly, you have glial cells, and these glial cells are support cells or worker bees, and they basically help neurons to do their job. Some glial cells actually make myelin sheath, and myelin sheath, like I said, speeds up neural communication. The last term here is the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, and basically this was part of the autonomic nervous system that was either fight or flight or rest, relax, and repair. So the sympathetic is the fight or flight, and the parasympathetic is rest, relax, and repair. Challenging concepts, take 3. Now we're looking at developmental psychology, and we just have a few terms to consider. Nature/nurture is, you've heard of this nature-nurture debate. Well, most developmental psychologists will say that nature and nurture interact with one another. So it's not about nature versus nurture, it's more about the interaction between nature and nurture. And epigenetics is really turning what we know about nature and nurture on its head. So nature is basically the like the genes, the blueprint you get, right? Whereas nurture is the environment, all right? So this is how your parents raised you, your socioeconomic status, all right? All right, for cognitive processes, this is saying that as you develop, as you grow and change over the course of your lifespan, you actually can change physically, right? You can get heavier or you can get smaller. You can also change in terms of your social relationships with your parents or your peers, but you also change in terms of your cognitive processes. So thinking, what goes on in your head. You could become smarter, or you could have deficits, such as in memory loss. All right, a longitudinal design. This is the study where you look at one group of people over a long period of time. So you start off studying them maybe when they're 10 years old, and then you check in again when they're 20, again when they're 30, again when they're 40, and all the way to the end of the study. So a longitudinal study is a long study. The last term here is Erikson's theory, and Erikson basically said we have 8 different crises that arise in our life, and they all center around resolving some social conflict. The very first one is trust versus mistrust, and this is where we establish a relationship with our caregiver. And at the very end, you have ego integrity versus despair, and this is where you either look back on life and you're satisfied, or you're like, wow, I wasted my time. All right, the last slide for challenging concepts, and then we can move on to some tips. Okay, some people struggle with classical conditioning, and in particular discrimination. So discrimination can happen with both classical and operant conditioning, but what discrimination is, you're able to pick out the difference between one conditioned stimulus and another conditioned stimulus. So think back to the little Albert experiment. An example of discrimination was the fact that perhaps little Albert was only afraid of little white rats with pink noses. That would be discrimination. The flip side of discrimination is generalization. This would be like how little Albert was afraid of little white rats, but he was also afraid of white furry Santa Claus mask and also cotton balls, anything that reminded him of that little white rat. So generalization, you take your learning and you expand it. With discrimination, you take your learning and you make it much more specific, much more discrete. In a way, you can think about multiple choice tests as a process of discrimination. If you find the key term or the key idea in the question, then you're looking through your choices and you're asked to discriminate among those choices, those 4 choices, A, B, C, or D, and find the one that most pairs or connects with the key terms in the question. All right, so operant conditioning is it's about learning through shaping and learning with rewards and punishments. It's much more of a voluntary type of learning, whereas classical conditioning is involuntary. B.F. Skinner and E.L. Thorndike are the pioneers for operant conditioning. Negative reinforcement and punishment are some terms that frequently people get confused, but the easiest way to separate them is to think about reinforcement as always leading to an increase in the likelihood you're going to engage in the behavior. And I know that's a mouthful, but just think of it like this. If you're reinforcing the behavior, you're likely to get it again. If you are punishing the behavior, you're not likely to get it again. You're really dealing with probability. So negative reinforcement, you can take away something unpleasant so that the person is likely to do it again. Whereas punishment, you can either add or take away something, add something desirable so they'll stop doing what they're doing, or take away something undesirable to get them to stop doing what they're doing. All right, with primary reinforcement, there's a limited list of things that are innately satisfying. So primary reinforcement, like food, water, sex. Secondary reinforcers are everything else. Schedules of reinforcement, basically when you want to train someone, initially you're going to have to use consistent, like steady, continuous reinforcement. But eventually you can pull back and you can apply a schedule. The 4 schedules that are mentioned in your textbook are fixed ratio, fixed interval, variable ratio, and variable interval. And the 2 concepts are, is it set, that's fixed, versus variable, it's unpredictable, it's an average, or is it interval based on time, or ratio based on effort responses. So you put that all together and you can see the variations. So rehearsal is simply like repeating something over in your mind again and again to like get it ingrained in your memory. And finally, implicit memory is also referred to as non-declarative memory. And it's the type of memory where you're not thinking about it. It's almost unconscious. Here's what you need to know. Academic honesty is important. On this first test, you used Honor Lock to complete it, and you will also be using Honor Lock for the final exam. Some of you were flagged, and you may have received an email from me indicating that you were flagged for a potential violation. If I thought that the violation was legit, then obviously your score was adjusted. If there was some, possibility that it was a mistake or that there was a misunderstanding, then I was lenient on this midterm. I do want you to keep in mind that I will not be so lenient on the final exam. So make sure your camera remains on the entire session. If your camera goes off for more than 10 seconds, I'm not going to count that version of the test. So you need to make sure you have that handled prior to starting the test. Second, I would say that mindset matters. If you go into the test with the attitude that you're going to fail or that I'm trying to trick you, that is not going to be productive. That's not the best attitude to have. Remember, we talked about the difference between growth versus fixed mindset. Even after you completed the test, if you didn't score what you wanted to score, keep in mind this is just one opportunity to show what you know. There's plenty of other opportunities to show what you know. You can take the alternate midterm and I'll average your first and second attempt, or you can try to do really well on the final exam, and we still have a few quizzes and the group project and paper. So mindset matters. And last but not least, try to employ some strategies. So reading is definitely a must, but don't just read to say you read. Actually question what you're reading, try to apply it to yourself personally. When you study, try to do it in spaced sections instead of all at one time. Spaced practice is better than cramming. That the research supports that. So it has to do with the way that we're wired as humans. Other strategies include when you're taking the test, go through the test and answer the questions you're most confident about first, and then go back to the ones that you weren't sure of. This way you can build your confidence, and you can make sure that the ones you know for sure you know are counted. Other strategies include thinking of the test in terms of what is the best choice. So narrowing down the options and then what's the best choice. Slow down when you're taking the test and look at all the options. And remember, you're trying to find a keyword in the question or in the scenario that matches with your choice in the multiple choice section. All right, if you have questions, comments, or concerns, you know how to reach me.